Okay, here's a Spectra Professional 4 light meter. And what a light meter does is it measures or meters the light. And it makes recommendations to you on what your camera settings should be based on the amount of light that's in a space. And to meter or to actually measure the light, you push this button. And so I push this button, and what happens is it's sensing the light in here, and it's making some recommendations to me. So what I've done is I've input the ISO. I've input the frames per second. So I'm saying I'm shooting a video at 200 ISO at 24 frames per second. Hey, light meter, what do you think the aperture should be? And it's telling me that it thinks the aperture should be 2.0. Now, if I block a little light out of the scene, and I push the side button again, well, it says, hey, you're going to need a bigger aperture because there's less light coming in. So if your camera's at ISO 200 and you're shooting at frames per second of 24, you're going to need a wider aperture. You're going to need to let in more light. All right? So if I move my hand and I push the button again, it says, hey, an aperture of 2.0 should be pretty good. Now, if I add some more light to the scene, so let's say I'm outside. This is to simulate sunlight. And I'm going to move my light meter so it faces the sunlight here. And I just want to collect all this light, and I push the button. Hey, based on the amount of light being sensed right here, if you're filming at ISO 200 with the frames per second of 24, hey, why don't you make your aperture 5.6? Okay? And that's how that works. And if I want to change my ISO, I'm going to go ahead and kill this light. And if I want to change my ISO, I push the ISO button and I change the ISO. So let's say you want to film at ISO 1600, and then I push my ISO button again to lock it in. And let's say I want to change my frames per second. I push the frames per second button and I push, go up to 30, I push frames per second. I'm going to push the button to sense the light. And it says, okay, if your camera settings are ISO 1600, your frames per second are 30, we recommend an aperture of 5.6. So that's how a light meter works. That's how this light meter works. And let's kind of put it to practice for just a second. So I'm going to slide this light meter over to the side. Let's test that out. So here's a DSLR. This is a Nikon D5200. I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to go into the menus. And I'm going to make sure right here that we're shooting at 30 frames per second. Click OK. Come back out. ISO, this is the camera set to ISO 200, so I want to move it to 1600. So I'm going to push the function button and change the ISO to 1600. And every camera is just slightly different on how to change that. But so I'm at ISO 1600, I set my frames per second to be 30, and it says to take a good image, your aperture should be 5.6. So I'm going to come up here, change my aperture to 5.6, and let's see what the video looks like. Okay. So that doesn't look too bad. That's what the camera thinks should be a properly exposed video or a properly exposed image. And that's okay. I like that. And in theory, and let's see if this works, if I change the ISO and the frames per second, it's going to give me a new aperture. And if I change my aperture, it should look exactly the same. The exposure should be the same. So let's change my ISO. Let's say I want to film at ISO 100. And I'm going to lock that in. And let's say I want to film at frames per second of 2.4. I lock that in, and I'm going to push this button on the side. All right, and it's recommending to me that my aperture be set to 1.4. And let's take a look. All right, so I need to change my ISO. I'm going to drop it down to 100. And if you notice, the image is getting way, way, way darker on the screen. It's hard to see. And I'm going to go into the menu, and I'm going to change my movie settings to 24. Okay, so now all my settings on my camera match the light meter except for the aperture. It's recommending that I go to f1.4. And so I'm going to turn my aperture ring up. And I can't actually go to quite 1.4 on this camera. It's 1.8. All right, so there you go. That image looks pretty close to the last image. If I could go up one more notch to f1.4, it would probably be exposed exactly the same. Okay, so that's how a light meter works. The light meter is just a tool to help you meter and measure the light so that you can set the settings on the camera.